Welcome back to the Chelsweets kitchen. Today is a very special day because I am making my wedding cake. I have all my ingredients ready to go, and I am making my cake a few days in advance because a lot of my friends and family are coming in from out of town, and I want to have everything taken care of before they get here. So it's totally fine to make cakes in advance. You can make your layers and your frosting in advance, or you can assemble your cake in advance as well. It all just comes down to whatever your needs are for the big day. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by making 7 batches of funfetti cake. To make my life a little bit easier, I'm using a commercial KitchenAid here. I actually bought it solely for my wedding. I've been meaning to get one for a while because I make so much cake, and it was about time that I stepped up and got one. So they're definitely spendy, but they're fantastic for making really big batches of batter or frosting, and it worked so well for my wedding cake. So this is an 8-quart bowl, and I found I was able to make about 3 batches of my funfetti cake in it. So this worked out really well, made my life a lot easier, and once the batter was ready to go, I carefully poured it into my cake pans. So for my larger cake pans, the 12-inch and the 10-inch, I made sure to use flour nails by flipping them upside down and putting them in the middle of the pan. Some of my batter missed there, don't worry about that. But it helps the layers bake more quickly and evenly, so I really recommend doing that with your larger layers. It's really hard to know how many batches of batter you need, and I actually have a really detailed blog post that goes through the math behind it. So if you're curious or you want to know how I do that, you can click on the link in the upper right corner. Once all my cake layers were baked, it was time to begin the frosting. So as you can see, I went through so much butter. I ended up using about 7 batches of frosting, but it can really vary based on how you're decorating the cake, how much frosting you're putting between each tier, and things like that. So you can always kind of have an estimate, but it can vary based on, if you're making a semi-naked cake, or if you really love frosting like me and you put a ton on the sides. So just keep that in mind when you're prepping your frosting for a cake. Once mine was all ready to go, I leveled all of my cakes using a serrated knife, which was quite a feat. I also trimmed away some of the caramelization just to make it easier to frost and smooth. And then it was time to begin to assemble the cake. So this takes a while to do, and since all of my cakes are sitting out waiting to be frosted, they're exposed to the air. To make sure that they stay nice and moist, I added simple syrup to every layer because you really want that moisture to be there when people bite in on the day of your wedding. So I added generous layers of frosting between my cake layers, and of course some more rainbow sprinkles. And this was my biggest bottom tier. It was 12 inches across, which doesn't seem that big, but man, it was heavy. It also used up so much frosting. Once I was happy with my crumb coat, I popped it into the fridge to chill and let that firm up while I began to work on my other 3 tiers. So for this cake, I made it with 12-inch, 10-inch, 8-inch, and 6-inch tiers. And this worked really well for the design I wanted to do with the cake because I wanted to have my flowers kind of diagonal across it, so I didn't need a really big gap between my tiers to put my flowers. However, it's important to consider that when you're thinking about the size of tiers that you want, and it's also important to think about how many people you have to feed. It can be hard to figure that out and get the right size for your event, but if you need a guide for that, I have a really great chart that walks through all of it and different sized cakes you can make. So if you want to check that out, you can click the link in the upper right corner. So once I crumb coated my cakes and then added that second layer of frosting, you can see I'm inserting bubble tea straws into the cakes, and they're all built on their own cardboard rounds. So the bubble tea straws are going to help the cake support its weight so it won't collapse in on itself. I'm also putting a bubble tea straw in the center of each of my tiers just to make it easier to slide on once I assemble the cake with a central dowel. So there is a reason for all the madness, and I promise that bubble tea straws are way stronger than you'd think. I don't add any supports to the top tier just because it doesn't need it. So once all of my tiers were nice and smooth, it was time to add that central dowel. So I actually sharpened my central dowel to have a little bit of a point using sandpaper, which is wild, but you can see the tiers slide on so much more easily than if it's flat. I removed the bubble tea straws from the center of each tier before I slid them on, and having that gap already open made it so much easier to stack these. I used a bit of extra frosting to cover up the cardboard rounds and any gaps between the tiers to give the cake a really nice and cohesive look. I used a small offset spatula to smooth out that frosting, and then it was time to work on our flowers. So I used a bit of floral tape to wrap the stems of each flower that I wanted to add to my cake, and this just helps prevent any of the fluids from the stems from leaching into your cake, which can give it a bitter taste. I'm also using clear bubble tea straws to add my flowers to my cake, and they're really wonderful because they create kind of a pocket that the stems perfectly fit into. It keeps them in place, it protects the stems from coming in contact with your cake, and helps you create the perfect look that you're after. So as you can see, I went with a lot of whites and greens for my cake because my wedding was in Central Park, and that was the look that I was after. So I was so happy with how my cake turned out. I added these flowers the morning of my wedding and successfully dropped it off at the venue before I got ready. I have a really long blog post talking about all the details about my wedding cake if you want to know more, so you can click the link in the upper right corner if you have any other questions that I didn't cover. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.